Hello and welcome, Alexa developers, to the last day of Alexa Games Week. We're going to be talking today with Senior Design Technologist Kai Lerch and Senior UX Designer focused on games, Joshua Balvin, about this white paper that they've written about how to enhance your board game experience with a companion Alexa skill. So I think this is a really unique, exciting session, and I'll turn it over to them to introduce themselves some more.
Great. So I'm Joshua Balvin. I've been in the games industry for about 17 years. As Joe mentioned, I started in tabletop games, so I designed a number of board games. I have 3 published board games, and from there I transitioned to video games. Most notably, I worked for about 5 years on a series of games called Scribblenauts, and then got into Alexa. Have designed a number of games also for Alexa. So very excited about this project. When Days of Wonder decided to do this, just because it is the crux of all of my major interests. So excited to talk about this.
Cool. It's my turn. So my name is Kai. I'm the technical guy in this session. So developed software my entire life. Currently, I'm a design technologist in the Alexa Games team. I joined Amazon 3.5 years ago and also the Alexa team as a solutions architect in Germany. I supported many developers from individual developers up to big companies to develop skills across Europe. I supported the launch of Alexa in UK, Germany, Italy, France, and Spain. I went on to lead a team of solutions architect for smart home specifically. So working with the smart home API a lot before I joined the Alexa Games team in Irvine. And I've been creating and launching dozens of skills on my own. So I got lots of experience with our own APIs. I know what it means to eat our own dog food. So if there are any technical questions, feel free to shoot them. Some guys might already know me. But yeah, that's it.
So, we're going to be talking about the Days of Wonder game a lot in this session, as kind of like a good case study for where a lot of these learnings have come from. And actually, let me just show a quick picture of what a completed board might look like in a Ticket to Ride game. So the basic game is you have some cards of different colors, and you're trying to complete these routes. And Alexa can do a lot to help facilitate the game. So Kai, what are some of these different use cases that exist for Alexa?
Yeah, sure. First, we should clarify what we mean when we talk about tabletop and board gaming. So usually this refers to a wide range of games that we talk about, and those typically contain physical components and are played on a flat surface like a table. That's where the name comes from, I guess. And those physical components, they include tokens, they include cards, dice, papers, pencils. The very special thing about this is that you actually have many people, at least 2, maybe just 1, it depends, playing those games. And then when we talk about Alexa skills, interacting with an Alexa skill, which is quite different from the normal use case. And now that you asked me about those use cases, we also introduced in the guide specifically for board games and Alexa, we found 3 main use cases. One of them is teaching. So a key thing when playing board games is to learn the rules, to understand the game, know how to set it up. And Alexa can actually help here by being the teacher. So she can, you can, with an Alexa skill, can create step-by-step instructions, tutorials, interactive tutorials that make it really fun to learn the rules while you are playing. It's not like you open up a rule book and then start reading for half an hour and then you slowly get started. The approach here is different. That you open up the skill, we welcome a user or a player who bought the game, might never have opened the box before. So when you play Ticket to Ride, you know that, or the Ticket to Ride skill is that we start or the skill starts with setting up the board game with you, and then start to teach the rules that you need to know when you do your first steps in the game. That is teaching. That is the first use case. The second use case is hosting, and hosting, it contains a lot. So first of all, it means what is a host? A host opens the door, welcomes you, sets a nice atmosphere, which Alexa can do by putting on some nice music, thematic music that fits to the theme of the game. She can add sounds that fit to the game. But for board games, I mean, there are many more or less tedious tasks where you have to maintain the game by tracking the score, by keeping time. That's what you can do with Alexa skills, and you might know that it's from a technical perspective not very difficult, which is a different story when we talk about user experience, but we will dive deep into this in this session. Yeah, this is hosting in a nutshell. There is a lot of things more, and I guess we have time enough today to talk about that as well. But the third use case, so teaching, hosting, but then also playing, and playing means Alexa competes against you, which is totally new, I guess, for at least for board gamers. So enabling an Alexa skill to be not only an opponent, but maybe also a companion. Depends on the game and the mechanic of the board game we are talking about. But also the Ticket to Ride skill that is part of the story of today can compete against you. So she can be your opponent in a Ticket to Ride board game session. And yeah, there are also many techniques, but also huge opportunity. So this opens an entirely new use case. A voice assistant competing in a board game against you. And this is one of the most exciting things we were working on. But yeah, those are the three use cases. Sorry for the long answer.
No, just to add on to that as well, a lot of where we kind of came up with these was speaking to different developers. So for anyone who, is familiar with designing board games or is in the publishing industry or anything, like it's very common knowledge that kind of the biggest barrier to entry for new players is the barrier of needing to understand the rules, to be able to read the rule, to be able to comprehend it. And so that is kind of like where this whole thing kind of started. That was kind of the catalyst for it. And particularly with, as we're talking about Ticket to Ride, one of the friction points of this particular game is throughout the game, you're going to be scoring a lot of points. However, it's very easy at different moments to forget to score points. And so there will be many moments that players will have like, oh, did I actually score the points for that route? Which leads you to have to go back and actually recalculate everything you're doing. So this is all in conversations we had with different publishers about what the big friction points were with different players and trying to find solutions that Alexa could easily solve for those.
Yeah, I really like that as Alexa as a mechanism to solve those problems. Myself, I've never actually played a game of Ticket to Ride without Alexa, where we didn't have to recalculate all of the points at the end, because someone inevitably drops something on the board and moves our trackers.
Yeah.
So, should we show a bit of a video about the beginning experience when you open up the Ticket to Ride skill?
Yeah, perfect.
Welcome back to Ticket to Ride, a daring adventure for 1 to 5 players. Welcome back, adventurers. If you have any questions or feedback about Ticket to Ride, please see the card I just sent to the activity feed in your Alexa app for details about how to get in contact. How many of you will be playing today?
2.
Ooh, looks like you have room for one more. Want me to join?
No.
Aww, maybe next time. Do you already know how to play Ticket to Ride?
Yes.
Great. Is the game all set up and ready to go?
Yes.
The only difference when playing with me is that I'll keep track of your scores and determine who has the longest route at the end of the game. So, anytime you claim a route, just say Alexa, your player color, and the 2 cities. For example, Alexa, green got Phoenix to Denver. Got it?
Yes.
If you have questions about the rules, just say Alexa, help. If you realize you've claimed a route by mistake, just ask me to undo it. The most experienced traveler goes first. Choo-choo!
Alexa, red got Denver to El Paso.
Oops! Denver and El Paso aren't connected. Remember, you can only connect one route on your turn.
Alexa, red got San Francisco to Los Angeles.
Making sure you're playing using the red plastic trains, and you have 3 pink or yellow train cards?
Yes.
That's 4 points for red.
This train is from San Francisco to Los Angeles.
Alexa, blue got New York to Boston.
That's 2 points for blue.
Now boarding New York to Boston.
Alexa, end game.
The game is not quite over. If you jump to the end of the game, you won't be able to take any more turns. Are you sure you want to skip to the end of the game and calculate your final scores?
Yes.
Righto! Don't forget, if you mess up, or I get something wrong, just ask me to undo it.
Ticket checks are now in operation. Listen for your player color to score your destination ticket cards.
Up first, blue player, whether you were able to complete them or not, how many total destination ticket cards do you have?
2.
Great! Now, please tell me both of the cities on one of your 2 destination ticket cards.
Denver to El Paso.
Rats!
You lost 4 points.
And your final ticket?
Kansas City to Houston.
Okay. So we can finish watching the rest of this a bit later to illustrate some of the other concepts we'll talk about later on. But tell us what we just saw here.
Well, quite a few different things. So one of the things that I think Days of Wonder did particularly well with this skill is, if you notice in there were a couple of mistakes that the players made, and what was actually found over the course of development of this game is that some people were actually not even playing the game correctly, didn't actually understand the rules. So you notice, like, oops, those cities aren't connected. Remember, you can only connect one destination, one route on your turn. And so that's one of the first things that we saw in there. But you just kind of like see how Alexa just really like guides you through the experience, what I like to call like an ad hoc tutorial. So you don't really need to understand everything that you need to know to play the game right up front. And the way that this is built out is Alexa gives you just enough information to get you playing as quickly as you can. And then as new things start to come into play, at that point, Alexa starts like, okay, here's the first time we're seeing this. For example, there are cases in the game where there will be 2 different routes between cities. And so the first time a player will claim one of those, she'll be like, okay, quick pause, let's talk about this right now so that you can understand how to play that. And you also notice in there how you didn't have to look and calculate the different scores of the different routes at the end of the game. We'll get a little bit more into that later, but you know, all of this is kind of like the accounting that can be a little bit tedious for players to do. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but this is just the illustration of how seamless that is over the course of it. So, and you also notice the different sound effects. I don't know how clear this was, but as you're claiming different routes around the map, the audio changes based on the locations on the map. So if you're down in New Orleans in that area, it would be more ragtime, whereas if you're in the West, it'll be a little bit more Western. So it just allows a lot more of an ambient experience as you're playing through the game. So that's a couple things.
Yeah, I do really enjoy not having to do the math. It's very nice,
Yeah.
and then having that nice background music, which is constantly changing, really switches it up. Making it specific to the areas you're claiming is a really nice touch. We saw a bit of the user journey here too, right, Kai?
Yeah, that was a snapshot, but the user journey, it's a great point, and probably you can bring this up. It's also found in the guide on page 3, I guess. So generally, what we found is that, so first of all, I just introduced 3 use cases: teaching, hosting, and playing. And think of those concepts or use cases as a bunch of features that you implement in your Alexa skill. But at no time an Alexa is just the teacher, is just the player, or just the host in your board game. It's more a combination of features that are present or dominant at a given time of the game. And we break it down to specific phases in the game that are usually represented by a phase of a user journey. So in software or in design, we talk about user journeys. And think of a player who just bought the game. The first thing which is most important to him is that he needs help setting up the game. So we have a setup phase where the teaching use case and the features which stand behind it are very dominant in that first user experience after you open the skill. Secondly, when you set up the game and everything is ready to start playing, what the player next needs is to understand the rules. So now Alexa jumps in to be your teacher, your assistant, guiding you through all the different things that you need to know. It's more exercising, so she will give you time so you can actually do what you've been instructed to do, so you can understand what has been described. That's the learning phase where teacher is getting a little bit less dominant just because some of the hosting components come in, some of the features that are implemented in the skill, like maybe you start playing the first music. After players get more confident with some of the rules, you can set the atmosphere a bit to get them in the right mood and make it more fun to learn the rules. And then we talk about the practice phase. Practice phase means that the user already knows the rules. Now they need to understand how to compete against Alexa, or how to use the skill, what to say. Also maybe practice in some turns, so they really make sure they really understood the rules. And at that point, teaching is getting less dominant. So Alexa is not proactively explaining anymore, but she might jump in at certain time when help is needed, or a new rule comes up, which is only relevant in a more advanced stage of the game and wasn't really important to explain in the very first part. As Joshua already said, is we explain, or we want to explain rules when they get relevant. Yeah. So first rules you need to understand is just the rules that when you start the game. That was the practice phase, and then comes the play phase, which is the fun phase. When you play along, so you play the board game many times, you know the rules, you know everything, you don't need the teacher anymore. Well, however, Alexa is still in the background, and she stands by for any questions which come up in regards to rules. Or even she can assist because she knows who goes next. Maybe someone cannot remember. You can ask her. It's one of the examples for a feature of a teaching use case. And then, of course, playing, Alexa playing as a component, as an opponent, as a companion, or even taking on a virtual player role, like a bank, like a banker. You have those roles which are usually taken on by one of the players at the table, but now Alexa can do that for you. And this is the user journey. And this is what an Alexa skill for board games can offer when you first open it up. Ask you to, if you need help with setting up the game, learning the rules, then practice and play. Of course, some of the board game players, they have lots of experience. They might not need that help at all. They jump in at the playing phase right away. But by implementing such a user journey in your Alexa skill, you make sure that you can address all the different player groups that you can expect to open your skill.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to look at this, and seems pretty applicable to a wide range of board games. We have a few questions in the chat here, and I encourage you to ask questions to these experts as we're going through these different topics. Animatronics is saying the multi-role use of Alexa in board games is even more useful in quarantine when you don't have enough players. But when you're testing the Alexa skill for Ticket to Ride, were there situations or questions that came up with the new player dynamic, and how was it addressed?
I'm assuming what I'm hearing in that is like when there are new players in the game. So really that comes out in the testing. And so I know that there was a lot of testing that was done for this skill with new players, with experienced players, where you would literally take people who are not gamers and would sit them down with a copy of the game and just like, at that point you're just wanting to see like, can they get into the game? Does this make sense to them? And I really can't overstate how important I think it is to get these types of skills in front of people, and all sorts of people from the very beginning. Because especially with a game that is as prolific as Ticket to Ride, there are going to be the hardcore gamers that you also are going to want to hear the experience from. But since this question addresses the newbies, yeah, that's what you kind of want to do. And Well, I'll talk a little bit about that process right now. We might get back to it for a little bit more, but I find that it's very important, even if it's just like writing up a script, to bring that to people who are not gamers and test it as early as possible, even before you really start to build the skill, to see how that works. And then as you start to construct the skill, again, bringing in new players and and really just kind of observing. I think that it is kind of important to kind of be a fly on the wall attitude. It can be very tempting to want to intervene on behalf of players who are struggling at a certain point in trying to comprehend the game and be like, oh, no, this is what this means. But, to really kind of like live in that struggle and, and then just really understand, okay, this particular section right here is causing some friction. And so it's time to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate how we're teaching this component, how we're doing this. And so I think I can't impress enough the importance of getting it to players, early and iterating on it. And with that as well, one of the things that I strongly encourage any developer who wants to do something like this to do is to try to avoid using, where you can, avoid using people who are on your team or otherwise have a vested interest in the project, right? Like really just like try to go outside of that. Like, does somebody have like an aunt who, doesn't really play games or, something like that. And then also to, like I said, resist the temptation to intervene on behalf of the players. But I also really like to have a well-structured feedback mechanism, which usually is in the form of a survey. Rather than a conversation after. Because I find that if you're having a conversation, sometimes people don't feel as free to give as honest a feedback. And so I have very clear things like, like rankings of like, how clear was this? Where were you frustrated? What was it clear to you? What could have been better? How was the pacing of this for you? Do you feel like you understood this concept? Do you feel like you understood this concept? And giving them the freedom and the flexibility outside of sitting there right in front of you to be able to kind of like express it. So that is kind of like the big feedback I would give when you're looking at new players to something like this.
That seems like pretty generally applicable advice for any kind of skill building.
Yeah, absolutely.
So actually, yeah, let's get into more about scoping and design. Like, how do you define features for these different main topics in the user journey?
That there's a couple different ways to think about that. Like this is something that I've been living myself as I've spoken to different developers at different tabletop conventions and kind of looking at the different types of games. I don't know that all of these different cases will make sense for every tabletop game, and I think it's just a matter of being able to sit down and kind of look at it, because one of the things that Days of Wonder did so well with this skill is um, Alexa doesn't need to know when it's every player's turn, which could in a game like this be tedious. Like now it's red's turn, now it's yellow's turn, now it's green's turn. Really, all that she needs to know is when you're claiming a route, and other than that, the game can actually just kind of keep flowing as it needs to go, which doesn't slow down the pacing. That may not be the case for all games. I do think, for the most part, teaching is pretty applicable to most of the games that I've taken a look at. And hosting can look like a number of different things. For example, in this case, it's pretty straightforward. It's just scoring, but sometimes hosting might look as simple as is giving you this really great ambient soundtrack. So you're doing an adventure game, and now you're in a cave, and so you're going to have cave sound effects. And now you have a dragon, so now the music will change towards that direction. So it might be something like that. And even with that as well, you can look at some of the superpowers that Alexa can have. So if you have a tabletop game, Alexa can have hidden information. She can actually even play the role of an AI character, or just like a non-player character. Again, kind of what Kai was speaking to, but she can take on a little bit more of a dungeon master role, which actually allows for an expansion of something that you couldn't just do in a physical tabletop game. So there's quite a few different ways that you can look at this, but I think it really is case by case, dependent on the game. But it is really interesting to kind of like look at each of these and scope them out, and then as you start to do the testing, again, the testing is where it all comes together. You can see this does work, this doesn't work. So.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the fact of Alexa enabling kind of net new experiences which you couldn't have in a traditional tabletop game, by having the ability to have that hidden information or serve a DM kind of role. Because there are some other games that use Alexa that kind of take that approach, like When in Rome, the trivia game powered by Alexa, and this Saint Noir over here that I have on my back shelf. Does a similar thing.
Yeah. What I can tell you about designing and scoping an Alexa skill for a board game, the guide talks a lot about this and also introduces an iterative process where you start with defining your target audience. So, and also what do specific users, what kind of challenges do they face when they play the game? Maybe there are some challenges that are not rooted to the game itself. Maybe there are social blockers, etc. Something which can be solved or addressed in an Alexa skill or a voice experience. And with help of the model, like the user journey graph, but also the categorization of use cases into learning, hosting, and playing, teaching, hosting, and playing. It's all meant to simplify that discussion that you have with your group, with your designers, but also with your software developers, because they end up implementing the whole stuff. There are some challenges that we can talk about later from a design perspective. It's kind of tricky to implement that and to represent that with a neat user experience. And yeah, so this is why we spend so much time in explaining a potential process that you can use to plan or to define this user experience. So defining the target audience, but then also the voice experience. And this is when it comes to listing down the potential use cases that you see for your board game specifically. And then script it down. I mean, you should have a dialogue in mind, how you want to interact with Alexa. How should it feel like?
Mm-hmm.
So does it work at all? Or is it just cumbersome to to talk to Alexa or let her know everything that she needs to know in order to be the opponent that you want her to be. So this is the scripting part that we talk about. And lastly, and this is when it comes to play testing, which is kind of hard when you don't have the skill, right? So you start with nothing, literally, and then but you want to feel how it is to play against Alexa, your board game with Alexa, and this is when playtesting comes into play. Pretending to be Alexa, we define some rules how you can arrange such or how you can set up such a testing session, and this is really cool because it makes you aware of some of the limitations that you might face, some of the design challenges that I was talking about. And this is when you get an early indicator of this use case works great, this is so fun, this is tricky, this is not so enjoyable. So this all can happen even before you write your first line of code, which for designers is very important, I guess.
Yeah. I would add to that as well. From a design perspective, I think one of the things that is important to focus on that I think was done very well in the Ticket to Ride skill is it's, especially since we're talking about tabletop, it wouldn't have just been enough to take the little rule book of Ticket to Ride and have Alexa reading the rules to you. Because one, that won't make a lot of sense because there are a lot of images and a lot of references in the rule books that you couldn't do. Like the way that I describe kind of the experience of this would be like, if you were to hand someone a copy of Ticket to Ride and send them into the next room, and then you're trying to tell them how to play the game from the next room, it's very different writing style than you'd have for the rule book. The other side of that is that I find that it's very important to have Alexa have a personality. And so, in the Ticket to Ride in the demo you saw, there were fun interjections, which are available on the dev portal. She said like choo choo and different things. And so as Alexa's teaching this game, because there are concepts, they were rewritten, they were kind of broken down into little bite-sized chunks to understand the concept. And then Alexa will actually stop you and just say like, got it? Did that make sense? And if the player says yes, then it moves on to the next topic. And if the player says no, there's actually some rephrasing underneath that as well that Alexa can do. It's like, okay, that was a mouthful. Let's try it this way and see if that makes sense. If that makes sense, just because I think it's important both for clarity, but then also to just have some personality there. So I would just encourage any developer to go to all the speech cons that Alexa has and really kind of troll through those, organize them, say like, here's positive ones, here's this, here's that, and then every so often just interject them to make it delightful for the customer, to make it a fun experience. But the more that you can make her sound like a player, the more engaging it will be, even during the tutorial and the teaching session.
Yeah, and I really like that point too you just made about kind of rephrasing the way things are said, because while it is more personable, it also might resonate better with particular players, so they might understand the rules better.
Yep.
And you kind of enforce that in the mechanics throughout these kinds of games. You have the ability to do so where the routes weren't possible to complete, for instance.
Yep. And that adds to the three-dimensionality of her as well. And there are certain things which you notice if you played with Alexa, you might claim a route she was looking for, and she'll actually react to that, be like, oh, I needed that route. You know what I mean? But it's those little things like that make it interesting.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Cool. So we had a couple questions in chat about the implementation of this, and this is a web API for games implemented Alexa skill where you can actually launch a web app, and we're going to have a session later on today where we're going to dive deep into that. But what kind of affordances does that give you as a designer using that, Kai?
You mean having graphical elements as part of the experience?
Well, that and some of the the differences in the way skill session management happens, audio. There were a few comments asking how the audio was done in this game.
Got you. Yeah, so this new technology specifically unblocked us in different ways, and it was something we really appreciated getting. And the ticket to ride skill, as you might know, was one of the first skills which implemented this new technology. New technology on Alexa, of course. I mean, we're talking about web. It's not new entirely. But yeah, I mean, we could deliver, or we could unblock Days of Wonder to do voiceovers over audio, music. It was not abrupt ending. Also, it meant something different for the skill session handling, which is also true. And yeah, I mean, it helped the Days of Wonder a lot in developing the skills and make the experience even better on multi-model devices like the Echo Show.
What kind of other general implementation tips do you have when it comes to implementing the ideas in this guide?
Yeah, a lot. I can talk a lot about this one. Can you bring up, I think it is on page 8.
Yeah, this one.
So I stopped talking about scoping and designing. Part of this process also is trying to break down a gameplay of a board game into its specific, into its granular components or granular elements. And we know, what you can see here is a model, and we totally understand that it might not, cannot represent all of the board games that you have out there. There are many, many mechanics, many different variations. But we found that this one was a generic concept that you can use to talk about the gameplay. So we break down a game into different variants. So there are many, or there could be many different ways of playing one and the same game. Maybe there is a battle mode or a single player mode, and those different variants, they can have specific rules which only apply on that variant. And then a game typically goes through different phases. So there is an opening, there is an ending, and each of these phases have rounds, and in these rounds, players do their turns. And in those turns, players make decisions and maybe take several steps at once, or have to decide which step they take. So this is very general speak, but you see that I can potentially talk about a lot of games and how they are played by using this vocabulary and by using this model. And this can help you when you start implementing, when you start giving your ideas to the software developers. Because when you are able to describe a gameplay and how a board game is played just by using this vocabulary, software designers find it more easier to start constructing software, right? So this can be a great instrument, and this is just the start, right? So this is my first tip when starting to implement. A key component with board games and Alexa skills is pausing and letting the skill idle for a while. Obviously, players need time to take action, they need time to think about their next move, and skills work in a way. They open the microphone, they wait for a couple of seconds, and then when the player does not respond, the skill session first of all, there comes the reprompt, and when there is no answer, the skill session closes. And you don't end up with the best user experience when you prompt the user constantly just to keep the session running. And this is when we introduced in the guide um, SSML audio to use for bridging these gaps. And at the same time, I mean, we already talked about it. Audio is a great use case. Music, playing sounds. And at the same time, it's a great instrument for keeping a session open. And when you go to, sorry for that, page 38, yeah, this is an example of how you can think of a typical Alexa skill session in a board game, when of course you have the conversation with Alexa, when it's time for her to interact with players, maybe instructing the player to now take the turn or make a decision, or the player asks Alexa something, whatever it is. But then you have those long pauses in between the players take the action. And then Alexa starts idling by playing audio. And this is what you can see in step 5, 8, and 11 in that when you look at this graph. And this is also how Ticket to Ride works, the skill. So when one player claimed the route, and then he got his points, and then he took his action or made his turn, then the next player is up, or even the next players. So players might end up just drawing cards, which Alexa doesn't need to know at all. And bridging this gap is just playing music, thematic music, which belongs to the city, which was part of the last road being claimed by one of the players. And this is about handling a skill session and using SSML audio as a great way not only to improve the user experience, but also to tackle the technical challenge of keeping open the session. So this is my next great advice, and this is very important. And of course, you have other ways to pausing and idling. You do not always have to play music. You can pause by using the SSML break tag for very short pauses, where just players have to rethink about what they have just heard, or just really need a couple of seconds to do something. Maybe draw 2 cards. You don't need to play music for that. You can still do that, but probably, it doesn't take so long. So this is pausing, idling for the skill session. And then we can talk about specific use cases or features like bookkeeping, score tracking, timekeeping, adding soundscape, or what else do I have? Game mastering, adding dynamic content. It's all described in the guide. There are so many things to talk about. For the audience, when you have the guide open, just look at the table of content. I think it's page 1 or 2. And then see what is covered and what you want me to talk about. You want Joshua to talk about. Specifically implementing the stuff or designing it, which is more something which Joshua can talk about.
Yeah, this is I mean, this seems like a really important point though when it comes down to the mechanics of it. Of soundscapes don't just provide something really nice for your customers to listen to. It's actually a mechanic for extending this skill session and making these experiences possible. I think that's very cool and clever. Okay, so tell me about some of the design challenges that you face when thinking about these kinds of tabletop experiences.
I mean, there's so many that to go in there. There just really are, because board games are all unique. So it just depends on which tabletop experience we're looking at. But I think the really the biggest one that I think was done so well with this was just the barrier of a lot of developers publishers, have the idea that their games are purchased and gifted to people, but people don't play them because they don't know how to learn them. So I think one of the most important and one of the areas that a lot of time was spent on for Ticket to Ride was out of the box experience. Like, so you can just open it up. It's very easy. It's very straightforward, and really having that just sing, because if that isn't, if that doesn't work extremely well, and if that is uncomfortable, or if that is off-putting at all, then the rest of it doesn't really matter. And so that, and that was really challenging. Like I said, just like in the development of it, there were so many different sessions, with all sorts of different experiences and not experiences. But I think that's kind of one of the biggest things. And the other thing, which is playful, is simply just playing with the different roles that Alexa can play in the game. It is a little bit of a challenge to understand what would it look like when Alexa is teaching you the game. What are the different things that it makes sense to have Alexa do? So, for example, in my own experience with some projects I've worked on with Alexa, I've understood there are certain things you just never want to replace. Like, it's easy to think about, you want to replace like dice rolling, but it turns out players really like to roll dice, and and even more than that, we've uncovered certain things like suspicions, or what do you call it, a superstition that players can have sometimes. Like, so if you were to replace dice rolling, if I roll the dice and I get a really bad dice roll, that's my bad. But we learned that if you literally replicate those same dice rolls on Alexa, players get upset with Alexa. So there's a little bit of a superstition that exists already there when you're trying to implement something on Alexa. But all this stuff, I think, I think it's very playful and very easy to spot when you're able to get it in front of people. And like I said, you don't even have to have a full skill built. You can test different elements of this with just, even someone just pretending to be Alexa. You can use the Alexa voice module in the developer console if you'd like to, and like just cut and paste the lines of dialogue, in there to try to replicate it. But I think those are the two biggest things, is making sure that you have the right roles for Alexa in the game, and then really nailing, if that is a priority. And I don't think that necessarily has to be, because there can be other roles where, like, where maybe it's just a game where there's a lot of moving pieces and you want Alexa just to track all that. In that case, you're not as worried about the people who are newbies to the game. You have a different audience there. But if you are going to go for that, which I think is a very strong use case for Alexa, if you do want to have that out of the box experience, really making sure that is the tightest thing, nothing else really matters if that's not really nailed down.
I love the mention of dice rolls, because we actually saw earlier in the week when we were playing the Starfinder Alexa skill. Now, while that's not, it's an adaptation of a tabletop game, but even still, as a voice-only experience, they allowed you to roll your own dice.
Yep.
Because it's fun.
Yep. Yeah. People really like that, and I think that's essential to really understand what are the things that are delightful to players, and what are the things that where it makes sense to replace those with something else, and that could be even, thinking further about that, when you have a tabletop game, and say you have an event deck, there's going to be a limited number of event cards that can exist in there. So the players, especially if it's a game that you play all the time, you might know what all those are, and it can feel a little stale. Whereas with an app, you could have an endless array of those. You can change those out. You can make them seasonal. You can do all these different things with it. And so that becomes very delightful. That is something where I feel like you're not taking something away from the players by giving that role to Alexa, as opposed to something like dice rolling, which is actually satisfying the players.
So we have a question from Anna here. Ticket to Ride is frequently played with kids. Do you know if there were any difficulties in writing rules or having Alexa interact with younger folks that Days of Wonder might have gone by?
I do know that there was testing with kids. I think that it was, I think that it was done, the age range of Ticket to Ride is really good. So that's for kids. And so that's, I think, the first important starting point. So I think, I don't think there were really a lot of issues there, just because the game itself is pretty simple. And in fact, I don't know as much about the development process on that side, but I can speak to that I've seen online reviews and different things have been posted where people have played it with their kids, and the kids seem to actually pick it up even faster than the parents, because it's technology. And so it's actually, and actually kind of made, I know that I listen to podcasts about board games and stuff, and sometimes parents are like, it's hard to teach the kids games, and they want to get their kids into games. And apparently this has been like really fun for kids because they already have an affinity for Alexa. And so to have Alexa doing it as opposed to your dad doing it, seemed to actually have been a big win with children.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
But that's a good question. So one thing we also had in mind, and the guide again talks about it, is expect users or players who never talked to Alexa before.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you can do it is during a rule learning tutorial, go clockwise and let everyone practice a bit before you go on with the next explanation. Because the family is joined by the grandmother, also the smaller children, and then everyone wants to start playing, or you want to just introduce Alexa as a great way to play this game in a different way. And then there is some social blocker maybe. Not everyone is used to talk to a voice assistant, and in order to break that ice, you can use the learning and practicing phase of the user journey, and then in the Alexa skill user experience to do that. Yeah,
it's a great point.
Very cool. So board games can be a really chaotic environment, a lot of noise, players screaming at each other, etc., broken friendships. How do you deal with that kind of chaos when designing Alexa board games?
We didn't fix the friendship problem.
Just make Alexa the enemy.
Yeah, but it's true that you have to anticipate an environment which is noisy, chaotic, specifically in time-based games, quiz games, and what you can do, and again, the guide talks about it, is anticipate those situations, maybe avoid opening the mic, maybe delay this a bit, also make yourself heard. If time's up, so tell them once, maybe you play a buzzer sound a couple of tries to really make sure the group got it and everyone stopped screaming at each other. So this is one way, and you will find it out when you play the board game with or without Alexa. So when you play test it, you will know when it's a time when it might not be the great idea to open the mic. Because when many people talk across each other, then you won't get a good result in voice recognition.
Yep, and I think on that as well, it's interesting, in my experience, how sometimes people don't realize that you can actually interrupt Alexa just by saying the wake word Alexa, and I think that's a really important thing as well. So when Kai's talking about having the pauses, we're not opening the microphone. There will be times when, so in the setup for this, it's like, okay, go ahead and deal these cards to players. And you train them very early on to say something like, say Alexa next when you're done, and then just have some ambient sound effect that's there and wait for them on their terms. And I know that in this skill in particular, the way that it was done is, I mentioned earlier how Alexa will confirm that you understand something. And, Alexa's then wanting to hear a yes, no, or I got it, or whatever. And if players are talking, what early testing showed is that if players were talking, they wouldn't hear that, and then Alexa would ask and get confused. And so basically, if you train them that they can interrupt Alexa, if they're in the middle of talking and they miss that command, then it just goes into some kind of ambiance, and they know that when they're ready to move on, then they just say Alexa next or Alexa repeat or whatever that looks like. And so I think that just early on establishing that, in a fun way, it just allows more control over that as well.
Yeah, one thing I liked about the Ticket to Ride skill is when there is such a moment where there is just a train station ambience and the group is going clockwise and practicing a bit, then you can still hear Alexa giving some instructions or letting players know how they can move on by waking her up with Alexa next. as a loudspeaker announcement, so which
Yeah.
really nicely fits into the train station ambience.
Yeah, that's a really cool effect. Anna commented on that a bit earlier in chat too.
Mm.
And so we have only a few minutes left. So if you have any questions, please post them in chat now. But one question I have is, how do you keep things fair?
Ooh, so
Especially like with
expand on
Alexa,
that.
with Alexa as a player, how do you make sure that she's not either overpowered or underpowered?
That's a good question. I mean, luckily, Days of Wonder, the Ticket to Ride app was one of the first apps that was ever out there, so they are actually experienced in creating kind of that opponent. And so I think it's just, part of that will be there are resources for understanding how to design an AI player in different games. And again, I think it will depend on the different games, but I think that just again comes out in testing. I know that over the course of testing of Ticket to Ride, especially when playing with Alexa, there was a lot of documentation about win ratios and like when was she being too aggressive, when was she seeming intelligent, when was she not seeming intelligent. All these different things that were being tracked pretty rigorously to kind of try to balance that, because again, at the end of the day, it comes down to a little bit more the feel about it, like what is an appropriate win ratio. For some games, if you're wanting to do, I'm thinking like an aggressive cooperative game where you want to be challenging, then maybe the win ratio would be lower than a game like Ticket to Ride where it's not quite as aggressive, and you don't want to have that. So I don't think there's a real clean answer for that question, but my answer just always comes back to getting it in front of people and testing and just really seeing what it looks like and getting their feedback on the experience. Was that satisfying? If she beats you so brutally, that's probably not going to be a very good experience. Whereas if she beats you, but it's so close and it's a nail biter, that's going to be a lot more satisfying than if she has a 100-point lead at the end of the game. So
yeah. So one thing to keep in mind, and this is a big difference, I guess, to apps, is everyone is playing the game physically, just Alexa is playing it digitally, whereas in an app, you also use the app to draw your cards. So now Alexa is the only one drawing from a virtual deck of cards, and she doesn't know which cards are remained in the physical deck, which is on the table. And this, of course, is a huge challenge. Yes. And it's addressed in the guide. So you have some options to address this, but it's keeping secrets and playing fair. It is a challenge. Yeah.
Yep.
So we have a question from Urban Blaster. Is this the official Alexa skill for Ticket to Ride? So I'm going to post the link to the Alexa skill. It is by Days of Wonder, and it is the official skill. There's also one for Ticket to Ride Europe, which I quite enjoy. We have a question from Lord of Sound saying, is asking how the loudspeaker effect was done. Do either of you happen to know?
Kai.
How the loudspeaker? Okay. So the loudspeaker effect. Look on the internet. There are some audio filters, and there are tools like Audacity, which makes it kind of easy to do that. I did it with FFmpeg. So just use FFmpeg loudspeaker effect, something like this.
Oh, okay.
You can get pretty good results.
Sorry, I have a cat tangled in my cord. Sorry.
Okay. And Urban Blaster is also asking, does one have to have permission from the game publisher to make these types of skills? Absolutely, yes. To publish these things, you need permission from the publisher of the physical game. All right, so I mean, we're pretty much at time here. Let me go and post a link to the white paper. Because would you recommend this is the best way to get started? Kai and Joshua?
Yeah, I think so. I think that yeah, like this guide is really essential. Like this is a lot of learnings that we have that that have been over the course of multiple years, lots of experimentation, and and then also just like nothing really beats playing it, and just sitting down and trying different facets of it. I know that that after I played it with Alexa, I never, even if I have enough players, I never want to play it without Alexa. But the big surprise for me of the game was how fun it was to just play by myself with Alexa. I generally always assume that the joy of tabletop gaming for me is being with friends and being able to do that. But there is something very satisfying about this experience that you don't really get in an app. It's a little bit more dynamic than that still. So
It's really interesting. Those are good closing words. Any tips from you, Kai, outside of the playtest?
No, I already talked too much about the guides. So just read it. It really has a lot in. And most of the things I told you, you can find in the guide for sure. I was the author of this guide, so it was quite obvious that I talk a lot about this. But it's most of the things that you need to know to get started. It's really worth a read.
Awesome. Well, if you want to learn more about the Web API for games, which is how this game had the UI implemented, the graphic UI, join the session at 1 p.m. today, which will be our last session of Lexa Games Week. Thank you all for joining, and special thanks to you, Kai and Joshua, for presenting this material.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe, for having us.
That was fun.
It was fun. We'll see you all at the next session. Bye.
Choo-choo.
Bye.
Choo-choo.
Choo-choo.